Here we have a typical coil of sterling silver as is purchased from the Sheffield smelting company. Most cutlery today is machine made. We are still producing cutlery in the old-fashioned handmade way. The coil itself is cut up into pieces which will then produce dessert spoons. The difference between sterling and the pure silver is 7.5% of copper, which is put in to make the silver more workable and harder. Fine silver is too soft. It's a very, very soft material. Here we have a sample case of the different stages of forging of the dessert spoon. Here we see the first stage, which is the piece of bar or slit, which is cut to size and weight to produce the article required, in this case a dessert spoon. The different stages, the first three after the bar, are the stages of the actual forging itself, which you have to have stages. The metal gets hard as it is beaten, therefore has to be annealed to carry on with the next stage. With it being a porous metal, the only way to soften it is to anneal it with a gas and air torch or whatever, which re-softens the metal. But as soon as you start to hammer it, or stamp it, or anything where you're actually beating the pores of the metal close together, it hardens it up. We centre off the piece of bar, and then there's just less than half of the bar will go into the bowl. Of course, the remainder then goes into the handle. The first operation, of course, it is to start it off by getting basically the bowl to start broadening out, and the shank or middle part of the handle to start to go in to form the round shank of the spoon. When you're starting off with just a bar of silver, I mean, you to a layman, you wouldn't know what you were going to make from it. As soon as the forger starts to forge that piece, the longer he goes on forging, the more you're going to see whether it's going to, for instance, going to be a spoon or a fork. He's forcing the metal out from the middle, and in some cases lengthening it also, because the piece of silver he might start off with might only be 3.5 inches long. The finished item might be 6.5 inches long. If it's a spoon, as in this case, one end he's got to widen out for the bowl, and the other end he's got to narrow out for the shank, and then widen out for the finished pattern on the top. So he's roughly forging it out to the shape that is required for the finished article. Here we have the first stage of the forging process. By hand forging, you are able to put the silver where it is required. On a spoon, namely at the point where most wear occurs, and on this particular spoon we are able to get the thickness down the centre of the bowl to produce the strengthening tail. The items that we do actually produce, there's a fantastic range of possibly things which only the customer has heard of, ranging from a mayonnaise ladle, which is a very tiny ladle, through to lemon fork. We produce things as large as the customer will probably know that as a gravy spoon. We can also produce ice tongs, with the cockerel's claws on the end for the ice tongs. Numerous things that we have made which are most unusual. We've made asparagus tongs, spaghetti tongs, more or less anything which a customer is likely to ask for, we can make. Among our past customers have been Henry Ford, Rothschild, Rockefeller, even down to the film star everybody knows, Ursula Andress. And some of the big banking organisations purchase our silver flatware for their dining rooms, for their top executives. One of the most famous ones, I suppose we would say, would be IBM. People of that nature who are, well, I suppose you would say, have to be fairly wealthy people to afford to buy or purchase our silver.
Rattling the shame.
Last January, for instance, fine silver was under £3 an ounce. This January it touched £21 an ounce, very nearly 22. It's come down a little bit since, and I understand it's round about £16.30 or something like that at the moment. It's still a hell of a jump from what we've been able to buy it in at this time last year. When the stamper is forming the bottom part of it, well, it's not a die as such, even though it serves the same purpose as a die. He will put the correct, well, usually a larger size punch in first into his top, well, die set, I suppose you could call it. He will then drop it down so that the punch itself is just dipping in to the place where he pours his lead, so that he has got a ready-made indentation in the lead when the lead has set. He then starts to form that shape into the lead by letting the hammer come down and drop into the lead, which means then that he can take the bowl down. In this case we call it dishing, which is like you don't take it down all in one fell swoop. You could tend to damage the spoon, you could tend to crack it if it is hard or something like that. But what they tend to do is they tend to take it down in stages to flatten out probably any bumps and hollers which have been left in from the forging on the inside. Finally, they will put not just lead on its own, but a lead and tin base. That is done when it comes to its final shaping or forming of that particular bowl. The correct punch is put in. The bowl is held over the indentation in the lead and tin mixture. He lets it come down and it forms, and with it being harder base that he's putting his spoon into, it helps to get the correct form and shape of that particular bowl. The next operation is then basically to go back to the forge, where they are then hammered out to a set length which is usually just under the finished size. So they may be roughly 1/8 of an inch under the finished or completed size. The stamper then gets the article back and puts whatever pattern is required on the top. In this case, it's the rib rat tail pattern. So he puts the rib rat tail pattern onto the piece of silver. Here we have a cross-section of the bowled-up dessert spoon, showing the different thicknesses which are achieved by a hand-forged spoon. Primarily, you'll get the thickness for the tail or heel, which on a machine-made spoon you will not achieve. Plus, the thicker point, where, as everyone knows on a spoon, you get more wear, while the point where the teaspoon with stirring, dessert spoon scraping on the bottom of the dish or bowl, etc. If somebody comes in and says, can you make us a spoon or fork? We can, on what we term a planer pattern, such as a rib rat tail, that sort of thing. You are not restricted, pure and simply, because they are stamped in 3 different sections: bowl, shank, top end. Polished, finished, or whatever you may like to call it, assayed. Now then, the fact, with a handmade item, it is more or less stamped in 3 stages. That is the stage there, to there, to there, to there. The fact that this is possible with a handmade item means that you can make any length, size, or more or less shape that a customer may require.
This is bending and setting. Important that the all nestle in one another. Right, that's it. We're striking off now to make sure the bowls is level.
All the excess metal is then filed away, what we call in the trade struck off. That means that they file across the top of the bowl to make sure that they're nice and flat. The bowl itself is then straightened off. Looking across, holding it up and looking more or less across and down from the point towards the handle, you'll be able to see that across the bowl is reasonably flat, or should be.
This also, at the assay mark distorts it in any way. We can tap the assay mark back, and if it deviates to one side, we'll pull it back over this way.
The assay mark is the customer's guarantee that the spoon is up to the required standard of silver.
We now make the bevel more prominent, and at the same time taking the fire off. This is a skin that's formed on the top when it's been annealed in the forging shop.
Well, that's oxidation. It is caused by the heat on the silver. When you get above a certain temperature, it will form a fine skin on the top of the silver, which in the trade is commonly known as fire.
Now this is a steel block. It's all right damaging the back end because we have to file this in any case. But we must be very careful about the front now because we've got a fire out and we've also got a bevel and a small tip at the top. So therefore we've got to use this lead hammer, which does not damage the silver. Process is done. Now we start filing the back.
To get down to the true sheen of the metal, you've got to take that top coating off. to get down to the actual genuine metal underneath, which will then polish up to the silver shine which everybody knows.
Here again, we've got to make sure we get it flat and it's getting the fire from the back, which is its skin again. It's caused by annealing. This is the straightening bar we use.
All this work used to be done in London, till it was blitzed. Then the only left was the office. Marshall House, I think the address was. But all the blade work used to be done in Sheffield. Meaning that anybody such as Mappin and Webb, Walker and Hall, as it was, and all the other so-called silver firms, which are no longer, used to buy Fletcher's blade and fork, which used to have handles put on. Not the silver as that. I'm talking about a pearl handle. Till the war. Then the forges that they had up in Sheffield then had to start doing the spoon and forks as this.
Well, this is spoon and fork muffin. Materials mainly are buffs, different sizes, sand and pumice. The sand is Trent, sand refined. Pumice comes from Italy, volcanic dust. This is vegetable oil I'm using to mix it up.
The men, or the staff that work here, comprise mainly of people who have been here years.
We start off by doing the tail first. This is the tail section.
I think probably Mr. Wallace, doing the actual hand forging, has been here over 30 years. And the other hand forger, Mr. Faulkner, he's been here somewhere in the region of probably 27, 28 years. The gentleman who does the filing, the hand filing, etc., he's been here 23 years.
That's now finished that part of the job. This is to get the oxidation out of the silver.
You take myself, I've been here at the beginning of February, 23 years. We progressively go down, of course. The buffer, been here around about 12 years. And so on and so forth. You know, you slowly come down the scale depending on what the particular job is.
Now we have to do them inside the bowl. This entails using 3 buffs. One for the bottom, one for the tip, one for the centre. I'm just making sure all oxidation inside the bowl is now out. We use this buff, which will be the last buff we shall use. We're really finishing it off now.
At Fletcher's, the main bulk of the workforce are people who have more or less come into the trade as young teenagers and progressed from there.
That's the finish of the buffing process. It's now ready for polishing as a finished article.
Primarily because of the fluctuations in the trade at the present moment, with the silver being at the sort of price it is now, I understand that there's quite a few firms who are offloading the workforce, which means that skilled men such as fully skilled silversmiths, etc., all appertaining to the silversmithing trade are probably going out of the trade. And then, of course, they lose the confidence if the trade happens to pick up. They're just not interested in coming back into it once they've had the experience of being made redundant and on the dole and that sort of thing. Well, it kills the passion for the trade, shall we say.
This is the bright finish. We've just seen the bright finish, which is preferred by the majority, but in the United States especially, a more matte finish is required. This is how it's done.
We go through the different stages, and here, the last stage in the box is the finished article, which is then wrapped, boxed, and on its way to a very fortunate customer.